Hello little humans, and happy Halloween! I've been invited by our very special friends over at the Museum of Make-Believe to share some spooky stories with you this holiday season. Now the first one is called Lady Amherst. Now, all my favorite stories begin with some very special words though. Do you happen to know what they are? It's once upon a time. Can we all say it together? Ready? On the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Once upon a time. The cries of pain came in bursts, and then quieted. All she could do was sit by her husband with her hand cool against the stubble of his cheek. She waited in silence until she was startled by a tapping sound. She should have been alarmed by the hooded figure at her kitchen table. Out of one black sleeve, she saw pale, slender fingers drumming the table in impatience. She watched, then quietly backed out of the room. The persistent rhythm continued into the night. Before the sun broke, she went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. The shadowy figure continued to sit, not breaking the pace of his fingers against the wood. She poured hot water into 2 mugs. As she slid the cups towards him, his hooded head jerked up, surprised. She wasn't supposed to be able to see him, this man of death. She could only see the darkness of the hood, but he wrapped both hands gratefully around the cup, taking in the warmth. Later that morning, he was still there holding the cup, so she replaced the hot water and he leaned forward into the steam. To pass the time, she began talking to him. She told him about her husband, how they courted, and how he knew she was meant to be his wife, even though she questioned it. She felt terrible about that now, that he was dying in the bedroom. Somehow with this hooded figure, the words just poured out of her. He was a good listener, encouraging her. The next morning, he wasn't at the table. She rushed to her husband's side, knowing that when her husband died, the figure would go with him. Her husband was still there, taking jagged breaths. Soon, the figure was back in the kitchen, holding a bunch of dandelions, some yellow, some already puffs. Of course, he didn't realize they were weeds. She pulled one out of the bouquet and blew the cottony bits into his face. He clapped his hand, delighted. 2 hours later, her chair was full of every bright flower in the neighborhood. It took them both by surprise when they heard a gasp from the bedroom one night. They rushed in side by side. It was clear that her husband was nearing his last breath, and the man of death rushed around in a panic, trying to save him. She kissed her husband one last time, and went to put her arms around the figure in the hood. When her husband's head fell to his chest, she held only air, the hooded stranger gone. For years after, she traveled to every deathbed she could find. Strangers or friends, it didn't matter. There was always a man at the table, drumming his fingers. But it was never the one she saw all those years ago. The man who sat with her by the ticking hours of the clock. The one she missed every day since she last held him in her arms. Now our second story today is entitled A Land of Great Inventions. Now can we all say the 4 magical words I like to begin my stories with? Do you remember what they are? Ready? Once upon a time. He held a crystal water pitcher in his white gloved hands. He wore gloves so that the pale crescent moons on his fingernails wouldn't betray his secrets. The audience would gasp as he poured the water slowly into his palm, and it would disappear into thin air. When the last of the water was empty, a bouquet of pink roses sprouted in his hand. The magician always handed them to his assistant, her dress glittering in the stage lights. She could see women fanning themselves, wishing they could take her place on stage, and she would happily trade places. When the magician first started practicing the trick to saw her in half, he was determined to use a glass box. For weeks, she had cuts all over the top of her knees until he managed to get it right. The magician would never let her know how a trick worked, but she watched him closely. At night, she practiced alone in the dark until she was as good as he was, maybe even better. After each show, he made her a bowl of thin oatmeal before turning the key to her room, locking her in. She worried the day he showed up with a large metal cage covered with a sheet. As he pushed it to the corner of her room, the bars trembled. He tore the sheet off and laughed when she jumped back, shocked by the big cat pacing inside. She held her breath when he reached his hand in to scratch behind its ears. The leopard leaned into the touch, but watched him warily. It took weeks to perfect his new trick. The first night he brought the cage on stage, the audience instantly hushed. With a wave of his hand, the cat was sitting outside the cage, and his assistant was in it, forlornly grasping the bars. The audience loved it, and the crowds continued to swell. What they didn't know is that each night after the show, the animal was set free in the theater to wander the halls, and she was put into the cage. Her meal sat on the floor next to a pile of straw. After the magician was asleep, the leopard would press against the bars purring, and she would talk into his ear late into the night. It was a month into the new act when they had their largest crowd yet. The spotted cat was restless, tasting the energy in the air. The magician waved his hand, but behind his back, she whispered a secret word. Suddenly, the animal was at her feet, and the magician was locked in the cage. He was so stunned that it took a full minute before his face reddened. She turned, smiled, and walked down the aisle of the theater, the big cat padding behind her. The audience thought it was part of the act and cheered. She slipped out the door silently, with only the shadow of the beast following behind her. All right, my little friends, thank you so much for joining me this story time. I hope you have a happy Halloween and a wonderful rest of your holiday season. Till next time.